Cop tries to arrest black woman for no reason. Then she flashes her DOJ badge. You never know when the quietest day can twist into a life-changing storm. 1 minute, you're strolling through a sunny city street, minding your own business. The next, a reckless force of injustice strikes without warning. That's exactly what happened to Nia Chambers, a well-respected black attorney at the Department of Justice. She was just grabbing lunch, savoring a bright afternoon, when a uniformed police officer targeted her unprovoked. Little did he know she held the power to topple the very institution he served. And little did he know his life would unravel in ways he could never imagine. Brace yourself, this story changes everything. A vibrant sun hung over Baltimore's inner harbor, setting the water shimmering with streaks of gold and silver. Nia Chambers inhaled the humid summer air as she left the Department of Justice's regional office, a routine part of her daily grind. She specialized in civil rights litigation, but on this unusually peaceful morning, the only thing on her mind was grabbing a fresh cup of coffee from a local cafe just down the block. She was confident, well-dressed in a fitted navy blazer and pencil skirt, and wore her hair in a neat bun, a professional profile that still managed to highlight her warm, approachable smile. Underneath that calm demeanor was someone who had fought her way up from modest beginnings on the outskirts of Atlanta. She'd once been just a wide-eyed girl with big dreams of shaping policy, bridging divides, and standing up for the voiceless. Law school at Howard University had sharpened her legal acumen, and a fateful internship at the DOJ in Washington, D.C., launched her onto a track that would see her rising quickly. 28 years old, fiercely dedicated, and carrying the weight of her community's hopes, she was not someone who cowered easily. Her usual route from the DOJ building to the cafe cut across 2 busy streets, and she was used to weaving through traffic lights that never seemed fully synchronized. She often joked it was a metaphor for the justice system, lots of stops, starts, and delays, but you ultimately got where you needed to go if you kept your focus. That morning, she noticed the streets were less crowded than usual, maybe because it was that sweet spot in summer when schools were out and families had left for vacations. Sure, the cars honked and people bustled, but the usual claustrophobia of downtown was conspicuously absent. She rather liked it that way. Yet somewhere in the swirl of normalcy, an unsettling feeling tugged at her intuition. Something felt off. She couldn't pinpoint it exactly, just a vague sense that the tranquil day was a prelude to a storm. As she crossed the last intersection before the cafe, she caught sight of a black and white patrol car parked in a nearby alley. She didn't think much of it, at least not then. If only she had known the turn her life was about to take. The whiff of freshly brewed espresso enveloped Nia the moment she stepped into Harbor Grind, the local coffee spot cherished by lawyers, interns, and office workers alike. She smiled at the barista, a friendly woman named Tasha, who waved her over. "Morning, Nia. The usual?" Tasha asked, already punching it into the register. "You know me too well," Nia replied, fishing out her wallet. She glanced out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the subdued rush outside. The city seemed in a mild lull, still active, but less frantic. It was in that quiet moment she spotted Officer Aaron Dalton stepping out of his patrol car across the street. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore sunglasses that reflected the mid-morning glare. Something about the way he moved felt deliberate, like a cat stalking unsuspecting prey. At first, she merely registered him as another officer on the beat. Nothing unusual. But then she noticed how his gaze darted around the sidewalk, settling on various pedestrians before honing in on her, even through the cafe's glass. There was a rigid tension in the line of his jaw, as though he was bracing himself. Instinctively, Nia felt her spine stiffen. Tasha returned with her drink, and Nia forced a bright smile, trying to shake off her uneasy feeling. Carrying her latte, She exited the cafe and started walking back toward the DOJ building. She had a brief scheduled with the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland in less than an hour and needed to finalize her talking points. Half a block later, she heard footsteps closing in behind her. She kept her posture neutral, not wanting to appear alarmed, but her heartbeat escalated. Then came the voice, firm, tinged with an unsettling authority. "Excuse me, ma'am. Mind stopping for a moment?" Nia turned around to see Officer Dalton, his expression unreadable behind those tinted lenses. Up close, she noticed the faint lines of stress at the corners of his eyes and a certain tightness around his mouth. "Yes, officer," she replied calmly, tightening her grip on her coffee cup. He looked her up and down, his stare lingering on her tailored blazer and the ID badge from the DOJ building clipped at her waist. She hadn't realized the badge was partially visible. Usually, she kept it discreet until she was actually inside the office, but she must have rushed that morning. "May I ask what you're doing in this area?" Dalton's tone was polite on the surface, but carried a subtle, ominous note. Nia's brow furrowed. "I'm on my way to work. Is there a problem?" He hesitated as though uncertain how to frame his next statement. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Suspicious activity?" She glanced around at the business people, tourists, and joggers, who barely spared them a glance. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "Suspicious in what way?" she asked pointedly. His lips thinned. "Could you just answer some questions, please?" A spark of indignation ignited in Nia's chest. This was how it started: vague allegations. An officer fishing for something, anything, to justify an interrogation. She thought of her teenage nephews, her father, and countless others who had faced this kind of profiling. She decided to remain calm, but she also felt the gravity of the moment, that unwavering truth that she would not let this slide. A light breeze ruffled the summer heat, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the tang of diesel fumes. Nia instinctively took a half step back, creating a little more personal space. "Officer," she began, making sure to keep her voice steady, "I'm a federal attorney. I work a block from here. I'd like to know what exactly I'm being questioned about." Dalton lifted his sunglasses, revealing hazel eyes that seemed uneasy but unyielding. "We got a call," he repeated. "We're required to follow up on any suspicious person in the area." His ambiguity rankled her. "And I'm that suspicious person?" She made sure her tone was measured, but inside, her frustration was mounting. She pointed at the steady stream of pedestrians. "Is anyone else under suspicion, or just me?" He hesitated, glancing over at a few bystanders who seemed to be catching on to the tense exchange. Two co-workers in crisp suits paused to watch. A young mother with a stroller slowed her pace, uncertain whether she should keep going. "You're free to walk away, but I'd prefer if you'd comply and answer some simple questions." "It'll only take a moment," Dalton offered, his voice softer now, but still unyielding. Nia's mind flashed back to her law school days, learning about the intricate ways in which seemingly routine stops could spiral. She wondered if he knew that legally, if there was no probable cause or specific reason to suspect her of a crime, she could indeed walk away. But how often did black people, especially black women, end up arrested or in danger for asserting that very right? Her eyes flicked down to his badge, Officer A. Dalton, Baltimore Police Department. She also noticed how his hand hovered near his radio. "All right," she said slowly. "What do you want to know?" His eyes narrowed, as if assessing whether she was cooperating or looking for a fight. "I just want to confirm your identity and what your business is here." The tension in Nia's shoulders relaxed by a fraction. Maybe this was just a run-of-the-mill check, albeit racially tinged. She took out her wallet, ready to show her driver's license. In the periphery, she spotted more onlookers gathering, the reflective glint of someone's phone aimed in their direction. A chill slithered down her spine. She knew how quickly these incidents could escalate. She also knew she had rights, and she wasn't afraid to use them. This was just the beginning, an unfortunate confrontation that could be over in minutes. Or it could spiral into something far, far darker. As Nia reached for her ID, she felt a pang of memory, a flashback to her teenage years in Atlanta, when her dad had the talk with her about how to interact with the police. He had been gentle but firm, explaining the unspoken rules of survival for a young black person in America. Always keep your hands visible. Speak politely. Never make sudden moves. If possible, record everything. That conversation haunted her still. Now, at 28, standing on a Baltimore sidewalk in broad daylight, she felt the weight of her father's wisdom pressing on her shoulders. She had become a fiercely capable lawyer, determined to fight injustice from within the system. Part of her believed that if enough good people got involved, if enough people devoted themselves to changing the laws and holding power to account, then real progress could happen. Yet, even with a Department of Justice badge practically clipped to her hip, she wasn't immune to suspicion. She was still a black woman, and that alone made her a target in some eyes. She handed Officer Dalton her driver's license, her voice controlled. "Here's my ID as requested. I'm also a DOJ attorney," as I said. Dalton took the license, gave it a quick once-over, then glanced back at her. "Nia Chambers," he read aloud. "Mind telling me your date of birth?" She complied, providing the information calmly. Her sense of unease didn't diminish, if anything it grew. What was he hoping to find? Surely running her name through the system would quickly show that she had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, and a spotless background. She thought of her mother, who had passed away when Nia was 14. If she could see her daughter now suited up, forging a career at the Department of Justice, she'd be both proud and furious. Proud of the success, furious that even with such accolades, her daughter could still be treated as suspect in her own homeland. Dalton nodded curtly, muttering a barely audible thank you. He seemed to weigh his options, as though some internal dialogue raged inside his head. Seconds stretched into an awkward silence. Bystanders continued to gather in small clumps, and tension rippled through the air like static electricity before a thunderstorm. Then, in a split second, the dynamic changed. Dalton's radio crackled, and another voice, an authoritative one, ordered him to pursue a possible suspect in a red jacket near Harbor Grind. Nia watched his expression shift as he processed that directive, but instead of leaving, he fixed her with an even more intense stare. The fateful moment had arrived. Would he let her go or double down? People are never just one thing, and Officer Aaron Dalton was no exception. Though he exuded stern authority, a storm brewed beneath the surface of that rigid posture. He was a man at war with his own regrets, haunted by personal failures that had brought him to this very sidewalk at this very moment. He'd started out with lofty dreams, a young recruit who believed in the mission of protect and serve, forging a path to do good in his community. But the reality of policing in a major city soon taught him that the lines between right and wrong were often blurred. Over time, the raw tragedies he witnessed, crime scenes, battered victims, unending bureaucracies, wore away at his idealism. Anxiety began to plague him, creeping into his thoughts late at night. He felt the system's cracks more intimately than most, but he also felt pressure to keep it together, hide his doubts, and soldier on. He'd grown up in a blue-collar household in Frederick, Maryland. His father had been a factory worker before an accident took away his ability to work. Financial strain built tension at home. Dalton took small jobs, landscaping, warehouse night shifts to help pay the bills while still attending school. When he finally graduated from the police academy, he saw the badge as more than a uniform. It was a symbol of having escaped a dead-end life. He wanted to be a good cop, a fair cop. Yet, over the years, Snide remarks in the locker room, questionable directives from higher-ups, and the relentless churn of the job eroded his youthful optimism. He sometimes found himself snapping at minor infractions, suspicious of anyone he didn't recognize in his neighborhood. The string of protests against police violence across the country weighed heavily on him. He felt torn between his vow to uphold the law and a sense of anger at being lumped in with racist or brutal officers. The tension became a slow, burning anger inside him, setting him on a short fuse. That morning, he was already rattled. He'd been written up 2 days prior for excessive force, an incident involving a teenage boy who was skateboarding in a no-skate zone. In truth, the complaint was fueled by a combination of factors: the boy's defiance, Dalton's stress over an upcoming departmental review, and the tension in the air following a high-profile police shooting in a neighboring precinct. Public scrutiny was intense. Everyone seemed to have their phones out, ready to document the next officer misstep. When Dalton saw Nia Chambers, a professional-looking black woman, crossing the street, he couldn't articulate why she drew his attention. Perhaps it was the faint glint of her clipped ID or the way she carried herself with such assuredness. A part of him recognized that she posed no threat. Yet the heavier part of him, laden with suspicion, told him that a conversation was warranted. It was as if by questioning her, he could reassert control over a life spiraling beyond his command. Now, faced with the radio directive to pursue an actual suspect in a red jacket, he hesitated. The right thing by the book was to let Nia go and respond to the dispatch. But something stubborn in him insisted on finishing what he'd started. He felt a twisted compulsion to see this encounter through, to prove he wasn't making a mistake. Pride, fear of looking incompetent, and a simmering undercurrent of racial bias, all tangled in a web of uncertainty. Standing before Nia, he saw the reflection of his own moral crossroads. She was calm, poised, and exuded a quiet dignity that only infuriated him further. He couldn't quite pinpoint what threatened him so much. Perhaps it was that she seemed unimpressed by his authority, or maybe her DOJ badge signaled a power that overshadowed his own. In that moment, Officer Dalton made a decision that would forever alter his life. He reached for his cuffs. The shift in Dalton's demeanor was instantaneous. His hand hovered over his utility belt. Nia's eyes flicked to the metallic glint of the handcuffs. Blood pounded in her ears. She had handled countless legal cases on systemic discrimination, but never had she been this close to becoming a statistic herself. "Turn around," Dalton ordered, his voice tight and controlled. Nia's heart hammered, but she kept her expression steady. "Why am I being detained?" she demanded. "Failure to comply with a lawful order," he retorted, his words clipped. "We need to verify your identity and ensure you're not involved in any criminal activity." She felt rage flare in her chest. He already had her license. He knew who she was. Her composure wavered, and she realized that, for Dalton, this might no longer be about procedure. It felt personal. Something in him seemed bent on asserting dominance. "You have my ID, and you have zero basis to arrest me," she objected, fighting to keep her voice level. "I'm an attorney with the DOJ." That last statement caught the attention of the onlookers, now forming a more defined circle at a safe distance. She could see a few phones aimed their way. The familiar refrain of "record everything" echoed silently in her mind. Maybe it was already too late for reason. Maybe this was headed exactly where she feared it would. The bystanders began to murmur, uncertain whether to intervene or remain passive observers. A curly-haired college student stepped forward slightly. "She didn't do anything," he yelled. Another woman in business attire pulled out her phone to call someone, maybe the police department, maybe the local news, maybe a friend. It was unclear. Dalton's face darkened with frustration. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one last chance to comply peacefully. At that moment, Nia weighed her options, resist, and risk fueling his sense of threat, or comply and allow herself to be forcibly cuffed despite being innocent of any wrongdoing. She took a deep breath, her eyes darting to the onlookers as a wave of disbelief and anger roiled in her stomach. "I'll comply," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and dread. "But you are making a huge mistake." She placed her hands behind her back, more to protect herself than to show submission. Dalton's grip was firm as he pulled her arms together, the cold metal of the cuffs snapping around her wrists. She winced. This was it, the humiliating moment she'd hoped never to experience, especially not as an accomplished attorney, especially not after all her hard work to fight these very injustices. She saw the reflection of the crowd in a store window. They looked on, horrified, some yelling for Dalton to stop, others capturing every second on their phones. And then, suddenly, Nia felt something shift deep within her. She realized she held a crucial piece of power, knowledge of the law, her position, and her unwavering resolve. She had let him cuff her to keep the peace, but she was done playing by his script. Soon, everyone would know who she was and precisely how wrong Officer Dalton had been. The storm had broken, and in its wake, the real drama was only just beginning. As if on cue, a second patrol car arrived, its siren piercing the already charged atmosphere. Out stepped Officer Lisa Morales, her expression tense as she surveyed the scene. She was a younger officer, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled tightly into a bun. Without a word, she walked briskly over to Dalton, taking in the sight of Nia in handcuffs. "What's going on here?" Morales demanded. She noticed the circle of spectators, the cluster of recording phones, and Nia's professional attire. Something about the scenario screamed potential PR disaster. Dalton gestured vaguely to Nia. "She's refusing to comply. Suspicious person, possible involvement in local disturbances. I was just bringing her in for questioning." Morales scrunched her brow, eyes darting between Dalton and Nia. "Any probable cause? We got a dispatch about a suspect in a red jacket near Harbour Grind." Dalton stiffened. "I'll handle the suspect in a moment, but I needed to secure the scene here first." By now, a few bystanders began to speak out more boldly. "She hasn't done anything," shouted a tall man in a suit. Another woman, her phone aimed squarely at Dalton, chimed in, "Is this how you treat a black woman who literally works for the federal government?" Morales turned to Nia. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and—" Nia interrupted, her normally composed voice slightly quivering with rage and humiliation. "I am calm, but I'm also furious, and I have a right to be. My name is Nia Chambers, and I work for the Point US Department of Justice. Officer Dalton is arresting me without cause." A moment of charged silence followed. Morales' eyes widened, and she looked at Dalton again. "Did you see her credentials?" Dalton pressed his lips together. "She said she was DOJ. She provided an ID, but I couldn't verify it immediately." Morales exhaled sharply, turning to the crowd. "All right, people, we understand your concern. We'll handle it." Then she faced Dalton once more, her voice hushed but urgent. "You need to tread carefully here. This could blow up in our faces." But Dalton merely folded his arms over his chest, his jaw set in defiance. "I have reason to believe she was acting suspiciously, and she refused to comply with a standard procedure. We'll take her in, verify the badge, and if she's legit, we'll release her." Morales glanced at Nia, then at the restless crowd. This was spiraling into a public relations nightmare, but the chain of command was clear. Dalton outranked her by a few years of service, even though they shared the same rank. She couldn't outright disobey unless she believed the order itself was illegal or unethical, yet the lines were already blurred. For the first time, Nia felt a flicker of relief. Someone else was on the scene, someone who might see reason, but it was too late. The escalation had already occurred. The next steps were out of her hands, and every passing second only tightened the knot of fear and resolve in her chest. Events began unfolding like a slow-motion reel. Each second waited with anticipation. A swirl of voices, phone notifications, and startled gasps filled the humid air. Bystanders converged closer, forming a ring that separated the cops from the rest of the street. The tension was palpable, people balanced between wanting to intervene and fearing the consequences of stepping too close. A middle-aged woman in a neat office dress stepped forward, her phone clutched in trembling hands. "I'm recording all of this," she announced. "Officer, you are violating her civil rights." A young man, possibly a college student, added, "This is going live on TikTok. You better believe the world's going to see this." Officer Morales, sensing the precariousness of the moment, turned to the crowd, palms up in a placating gesture. "Please keep a safe distance," she implored. "We'll resolve this peacefully." Meanwhile, Dalton's face was drained of color, and sweat beaded on his forehead. If he was rattled by the crowd's reaction, he didn't show it beyond a tight-lipped frown. He held onto Nia's arm, guiding her toward the patrol car. She stumbled briefly, the cuffs restricting her balance, and a fresh wave of angry murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Nia's mind raced. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to shout out her legal knowledge, to quote statutes and threaten lawsuits. But she also knew that a black woman, even a DOJ attorney, had to be strategic, or this could become a physical altercation, something she might not walk away from unscathed. Instead, she locked eyes with one of the bystanders, a tall black man in a crisp suit, whose phone was pointed in her direction. "Please don't stop recording," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "Do not stop until this is over." He nodded, silent determination etched on his face. Dalton opened the back door of the squad car and guided Nia inside. She winced as her shoulder grazed the interior. From her limited vantage, she saw Morales in hurried conversation with Dalton, probably urging him to reconsider. Yet, the outcome seemed inevitable. He was taking her to the station. It was a surreal tableau, a black woman in professional attire, a federal attorney no less, being placed under arrest by local law enforcement on a near-empty street in Baltimore. The cameras rolled, capturing every detail: Dalton's terse grip, Morales' worried stance, and Nia's calm but furious expression, a tightness clenched in Nia's chest. She could practically see the social media headlines forming in real time. She wondered how her colleagues at the DOJ would react, how local activists would mobilize, and how her family would feel seeing her in handcuffs. But one thing burned brighter than the shame and shock: the unwavering conviction that she had the law and justice on her side. And the moment she had her chance, she intended to prove it in a way that neither Officer Dalton nor anyone watching would forget. She didn't have to wait long for that chance. Only a minute into the drive to the station, Nia felt the momentum shift. Officer Morales had joined Dalton in the cruiser, evidently to de-escalate or at least witness the proceedings. She sat in the front passenger seat, repeatedly glancing back at Nia through the metal divider. "Why don't you let me see that badge?" she was talking about. Morales finally said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Dalton gave her a side-eye glare. "We'll handle it at the station," Morales persisted. "Aaron, if she's really DOJ, we need to confirm that before we go any further. We can't just bring a federal attorney in without verifying credentials. It's going to be a nightmare." Dalton hesitated, jaw clenched. The simmering anger in his eyes suggested he knew Morales was right, but didn't want to concede. Finally, he flicked on the interior light and turned to look back at Nia. "All right, Miss Chambers, you said you had a DOJ badge," he said, forcing a tight-lipped politeness. "Let's see it." Nia narrowed her eyes. Her wrists were still cuffed behind her back. "I can't reach for anything while I'm cuffed," she reminded him. She didn't bother to hide the sarcasm. Morales turned, awkwardly maneuvering over the car seat to search for the badge on Nia's person. Her tone was apologetic. "I'm just going to check your blazer pocket, okay?" Nia nodded, a swirl of indignation flooding her senses as she felt Morales pat her blazer, eventually finding the slim leather holder that contained her Department of Justice identification. The younger officer flipped it open and squinted. Aaron," Morales said carefully, "this is real. Her ID's from the Civil Rights Division in D.C., and this is an official Department of Justice badge." Silence. Dalton gripped the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. He exhaled slowly, refusing to meet Morales' gaze. Nia saw a flicker of regret, or perhaps fear, cross his face. "Miss Chambers," Morales continued, her voice calmer now, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Let's just talk this through." Nia's pulse pounded. It was a moment of vindication but also intense anger. She let the weight of her next words sink in. "Inconvenience. Officer, you're complicit in an unlawful arrest. You've cuffed and detained a federal attorney with absolutely no probable cause. This goes beyond an inconvenience. You understand that, don't you?" Morales swallowed hard, nodding. "I do. Let's rectify this." She leaned over, whispering something to Dalton. Whatever she said, it appeared to have little effect on him. He stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. But finally, he pulled the squad car to the side of the road in a quieter section near City Hall. They parked. The city's grand municipal building towered in the background, almost a metaphor for the law itself, overshadowing them. Dalton turned off the engine, and Morales quickly stepped out to open the back door. She helped Nia out of the car and motioned for Dalton to step aside. He emerged slowly, the keys to the cuffs dangling in his hand. For a moment, he just looked at Nia, conflict and stubborn pride wrestling behind his eyes. Then, almost reluctantly, he unlocked her cuffs. Nia massaged her wrists, noting the red marks. She wanted to unleash her fury. How dare he treat her this way? She could sue, press formal charges, and ensure a thorough internal affairs investigation. But she also felt a wave of professional composure wash over her. She wasn't going to be reduced to primal anger. She was more than that, and so were the laws she was sworn to uphold. "Officer Dalton," she said, voice measured, "I'll be filing a complaint with Baltimore PD, Internal Affairs. I'm also obligated to inform my DOJ supervisors about this incident." She held up her badge. "Remember, we investigate cases of police misconduct and civil rights violations." "You just made this incredibly easy for me." Dalton opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Morales stood nearby, a mixture of relief and embarrassment coloring her features. "Ma'am, I understand you have every right to do that. But please, can we at least—" Nia cut her off. "I'll do what I must, officer. The first suggest you consult your department's legal counsel." She stepped back onto the sidewalk, ignoring the curious stares of a few late-working city employees wandering by. The ball was now in her court. The moment she'd flashed that badge, that unimpeachable symbol of federal authority, had irrevocably shifted the power dynamic. And deep down, she knew that Officer Dalton's world was about to implode in ways he couldn't yet fathom. In the days that followed, the incident ignited a firestorm both online and off. Videos of Nia's arrest, captured by multiple bystanders, circulated rapidly on social media. The footage highlighted the stark reality of a black DOJ attorney being handcuffed on a public street without cause. Within 24 hours, #NiaChambers and #BaltimorePDM misconduct began trending on Twitter, prompting a whirlwind of public outrage. Local news outlets picked up the story, airing clips that showed Nia calmly explaining her DOJ credentials while Dalton proceeded to cuff her. The commentary was swift and unyielding. Even national networks like CNN and MSNBC began to weigh in, fueling a broader debate about racial profiling and law enforcement accountability. More than once, the name Officer Aaron Dalton was mentioned in conjunction with calls for reform and disciplinary action. Inside the Department of Justice, Nia's colleagues responded with a mix of shock and support. Many were outraged, some humiliated that one of their own had been subjected to such treatment. Federal attorneys who had worked on civil rights cases for years found themselves grappling with a jarring reminder of the biases still deeply embedded in the justice system. Emails circulated urging staff to attend a special meeting on police accountability and next steps hosted at the DOJ's main office in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, the Baltimore Police Department's Internal Affairs Division wasted no time launching an investigation. Under the relentless glare of media scrutiny, they had little choice. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed body cam footage, though Dalton's camera apparently malfunctioned during the arrest, and pored over social media videos. Officer Morales, who had eventually intervened, became a key witness, describing how she discovered Nia's official badge and tried to de-escalate the situation. Officer Aaron Dalton found himself at the center of a media maelstrom. He was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours, pending the outcome of the investigation. As public outcry grew, city officials, including the mayor of Baltimore, issued careful statements. Most were along the lines of, "We take these allegations seriously and are committed to a fair, transparent investigation." But the undercurrent was clear. Dalton had to answer for what he'd done. For Nia, the personal and professional fallout was equally consuming. She received an outpouring of support flowers, emails, and social media messages from people across the country praising her courage. But she also faced the inevitable vitriol that surfaces whenever someone in a position of power challenges the status quo. Anonymous threats, hateful comments, and racial slurs found their way into her inbox. She tried to focus on the positive, reminding herself that her ordeal could spark real change. At times, she felt a pang of guilt that she had become the story rather than the civil rights cases she was supposed to be championing. But a conversation with her supervisor put that in perspective. Nia, he said softly, "You embody the work we do. You have a right to stand up for yourself, and in doing so, you stand up for every person who's been profiled and harassed. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." She nodded, heart heavy with the knowledge that her personal fight had become a public symbol. She resolved to see this through, no matter how messy or complicated it got. 1 week after the incident, Nia found herself in a fluorescent lit conference room in the Baltimore PD's Internal Affairs Division. 2 investigators, Lieutenant Sarah Weathers and Sergeant Christopher Park, sat across from her, notebooks at the ready. Weathers, an older woman with grey-streaked hair, offered a polite nod while Park maintained a neutral expression. "Miss Chambers," Weathers began, "we appreciate your willingness to come in. We know this has been stressful for you, but we want to ensure we get all the details right." Nia clasped her hands on the table. Despite her composed exterior, she felt an undercurrent of tension. She'd testified in many cases, but this was the first time she was the plaintiff, the complainant, the wronged party. "I'm here to answer any questions you have," she said calmly. She recounted the entire incident, her morning walk to the cafe, Officer Dalton's initial approach, the escalating confrontation, and how she was ultimately handcuffed without cause. When she spoke about the moment Morales found her DOJ badge, she sensed Weathers shift uncomfortably in her seat. Park asked a few clarifying questions. Had Dalton explicitly stated a reason for detaining her? Had she resisted physically at any point? Did he mention reading her Miranda rights? The more questions they asked, the clearer it became that Dalton had acted with a glaring absence of proper procedure. After Nia finished, Weathers nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Miss Chambers. We also have witness statements and video evidence that largely corroborate your account." She glanced at Park, who gave a grim nod. Nia knew what that nod meant. They had enough evidence to demonstrate misconduct. Whether it rose to the level of termination or criminal charges was another question, but at minimum, Dalton's actions were indefensible. Weathers offered a final remark. "We can't comment on potential disciplinary measures yet, but please know that we're conducting this investigation thoroughly. The Chief of Police has made it clear this must be handled by the book." Nia rose from her seat, feeling a mix of relief and lingering frustration. "I appreciate that. I hope you'll consider not just the facts of my case, but the broader issues at play. This could have been someone without a federal badge or legal knowledge. It's unacceptable." Weathers nodded slowly. "Believe me, I understand. We have a lot of work to do." As Nia exited the building, she spotted Officer Morales in a hallway, flipping through paperwork. Their eyes met, and Morales gave a small, hesitant smile. Nia nodded in return, acknowledging that Morales had at least tried to mitigate the damage. But Nia also knew that one well-intentioned officer couldn't absolve a department's culture, nor erase the trauma she'd endured. Stepping out into the midday sun, she inhaled deeply. The fight wasn't over. Her complaint was only one step in a labyrinthine process. Yet, she felt a renewed sense of resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about every innocent person who'd been slapped with cuffs, or worse, for fitting a description or walking in the wrong neighborhood. And she was determined to see this through to the end. That evening, as Nia returned to her apartment in Federal Hill, she found a thick manila envelope wedged behind her mail slot. Puzzled, she carried it inside and locked the door behind her. The envelope bore no return address, just her name scrawled in bold black letters. She opened it carefully, half expecting hateful messages or thinly veiled threats. Instead, she found a stack of documents, news clippings and photographs, each detailing multiple instances of alleged misconduct by Officer Aaron Dalton. There were witness statements from other individuals claiming racial profiling, a note about a teenage boy injured in a scuffle, and even a suspicious death in custody that was never fully explained. Shaken, Nia sank onto her couch, flipping through the pages. One statement was from a local father who claimed Dalton had pulled over his son numerous times without cause. Another described how Dalton had used unnecessary force during a routine stop. Had the media coverage of her arrest emboldened these people to come forward? Or was someone orchestrating a takedown of Dalton by linking her case with a broader pattern? She felt a flicker of uneasy excitement. As an attorney in the Civil Rights Division, she had the expertise to interpret these documents. This wasn't just a collection of random complaints. It was a potential blueprint for a federal investigation that could expose widespread misconduct if it was all substantiated. But who had left it for her, and why anonymously? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. After scanning the papers, she called her supervisor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Eric Dubois. A man known for his meticulously combed hair and no-nonsense approach to cases, Dubois answered on the second ring. "Nia, everything all right?" he asked. "It's late. I just received documents implicating Officer Dalton in multiple misconduct cases," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. She explained the contents of the envelope, concluding with, "It looks like a pattern, Eric. This isn't a one-off." He was silent for a moment. "Bring them in tomorrow morning. We'll review everything, see if any of this is credible. If it is, we might consider opening a broader civil rights investigation." Nia felt a surge of determination. Will do. And Eric, there's a chance this extends beyond Dalton to others in the department. She heard him sigh on the other end. This could be explosive. We have to tread carefully. But you know I won't back down if there's merit. She hung up, heart thudding in her chest. This was bigger than her personal case. Her altercation with Dalton could be the catalyst that exposed a much deeper rot. Yet, with that power came risk. If someone had gone to the trouble of sending her these documents anonymously, it meant they were either scared or had their own agenda. Either way, she'd just become a central figure in a much larger battle. Before going to bed, she organized the documents in chronological order, making notes about each case's key details. She recognized some of the patterns: unlawful stops, racial profiling, intimidation tactics that she'd studied academically and prosecuted professionally. But reading them now, in the context of her own harrowing experience, made the injustice painfully concrete. She lay awake that night, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying Dalton's cold stare in her mind. He wasn't just an officer who had made a tragic, racially biased mistake. He could be a repeat offender with a history of trampling on people's rights. And if so, her job was clear. She had to bring the full weight of federal oversight upon him and, potentially, an entire web of complicit actors. The process moved quickly after the envelope's revelations. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Justice announced it was launching a formal civil rights investigation into Officer Aaron Dalton and the Baltimore Police Department, focusing on allegations of repeated misconduct, racial profiling, and excessive force. The local media exploded with updates, each day bringing new stories of individuals who stepped forward with their own accounts of unjust treatment. Under normal circumstances, investigating a single officer might not expand into a departmental probe so swiftly. But the combination of incontrovertible video evidence of Nia's arrest, her role as a DOJ attorney, and the anonymous documents pointing to Dalton's long-standing pattern of abuse put immense pressure on city officials. The mayor had no choice but to cooperate fully, lest the city face yet another wave of protests and lawsuits. Faced with the investigation, Officer Dalton's life took a sharp, downward spiral. Initially placed on administrative leave, he was soon suspended without pay as more evidence stacked up against him. He found himself scrutinized in the media to an almost unbearable degree. Local and national reporters dug into his past, unearthing old high school acquaintances, prior complaints, and even personal financial troubles. It didn't stop there. One of the families he had allegedly harassed filed a civil lawsuit against him. Their press conference was televised, showing a tearful mother describing how Dalton had manhandled her teenage son for skateboarding near a public library. Another complaint from 2 years ago involved a Hispanic man who claimed Dalton had detained him without cause and hurled ethnic slurs. The deeper the investigation delved, the more a pattern of racially motivated harassment emerged. Dalton tried to fight back, hiring a high-priced lawyer who specialized in defending police accused of misconduct. He claimed he was a scapegoat, a victim of anti-police bias in the media, and that his body cam failures were mere technical glitches. But public sentiment was overwhelmingly against him. Even inside the police department, some colleagues distanced themselves, not wanting to go down with a sinking ship. The real blow came when federal prosecutors indicted Dalton on charges of violating civil rights under color of law. If convicted, he could face years in federal prison. The man who once saw his badge as a way out of a dead-end life was now on the verge of losing everything: his career, his freedom, and any shred of dignity he had left. For Nia, watching the fallout was simultaneously vindicating and heart-wrenching. She had no sympathy for Dalton's abusive actions, but she understood too well how a system rife with flawed training, Systemic biases and poor oversight could warp an officer's perspective. Yet Dalton had made his choices that harmed many. This was, in many ways, the system finally demanding its debt. Still, Nia remained focused on the bigger picture. The investigation might end Dalton's career, but it also exposed deeper fissures in the Baltimore PD. She resolved to work diligently with her DOJ colleagues to enact reforms, monitor departmental changes, and ensure that the next generation of officers would be better trained and more accountable. Karma had indeed struck Dalton, but a larger reckoning was taking place, one that, if handled properly, could lead to real lasting change for the community he had sworn to serve. 3 months after the Department of Justice announced its investigation, Nia walked the familiar path to the DOJ's Baltimore office. She'd taken on a leadership role in crafting the reforms recommended for the Baltimore Police Department, working closely with local officials to restructure training and oversight policies. Weekly community forums were held, inviting members of the public to share their experiences and suggestions. It was an unprecedented level of collaboration, spurred by the public outrage and the subsequent official action. Nia's days were a blur of meetings, legal research, and strategy sessions, but she found it invigorating. Every page of policy she drafted, every recommendation she helped refine, felt like a step toward a more equitable system. She wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had, being handcuffed on a sidewalk just for existing as a person of color. Meanwhile, the city itself was in the throes of transformation. Press conferences were held almost weekly as the mayor and the new police chief, a reform-minded official named Adele Carver, outlined steps to rebuild trust. New training programs focusing on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement were launched. Bodycams became mandatory, with strict penalties for malfunctioning devices. Civilian oversight committees gained broader powers to investigate misconduct and recommend disciplinary actions. In a twist no one could have predicted, Officer Lisa Morales volunteered to be one of the first to undergo the new rigorous training regimen. She publicly expressed regret for not doing more to stop Dalton sooner, stating, "I want to serve my city honorably. I can't do that if I don't confront the systemic biases and blind spots in law enforcement." Her candor resonated with the public, and she became an unlikely ambassador for departmental reform. As for Dalton, his trial date approached swiftly. Rumors circulated that he might seek a plea deal, possibly testifying against higher-ups who had overlooked or even encouraged his misconduct. The city buzzed with speculation. Could Dalton's revelations bring down more officers? Could it expose a deeper corruption network within the department? The tension was palpable, a collective holding of breath. Nia watched it all with a tempered optimism. If Dalton's testimony could dismantle a rotten foundation, perhaps it was one more step toward a fairer future. But she also knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. Institutions resisted upheaval, and those who benefited from the status quo often fought ferociously to maintain it. One evening, after a long day reviewing policy drafts, Nia stopped by a local church that was hosting a community dialogue session. She took a seat near the back, intending to observe quietly. Speaker after speaker took the mic, sharing stories of police interactions, some horrifying, some hopeful. When it was nearly over, a teenage girl in a denim jacket approached the stage. Her voice quivered as she said, "I just want to thank Miss Chambers, who I see sitting in the audience. Because of her, I'm not afraid to walk down the street anymore." Nia blinked back tears. She hadn't realized how personally her ordeal and her fight for justice had impacted people. Maybe that was the real reason she became an attorney, to make life better for others, to be the spark that ignited change. Hearing this young girl's gratitude made every challenge, every late night at the office, and every media storm worth it. And as the applause swelled, Nia felt a swell of warmth in her chest. She stood and smiled, offering a small wave, silently acknowledging that the fight for justice was far from over, but it was definitely worth fighting. And there you have it. An ordinary day turned into a frontline battle against injustice. Nia Chambers' story reminds us that sometimes we don't choose our battles choose us. Her courage in the face of blatant racial profiling sparked a wave of reform, shining a spotlight on abuses that might otherwise have stayed hidden. But this fight isn't just hers. It belongs to every person who believes in a fair and just society. Thank you for tuning in and following this powerful journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it lit a fire in your own heart for change, then help keep the conversation alive. Hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you'll never miss another thought-provoking story. Because together, we can raise our voices, challenge what's wrong, and build a better, more equitable future for everyone.